I want to talk about something that I've been involved with. I've been an academic for nearly 3 decades, and my area of interest is recreational drug use. Use in festivals, in nightclubs, and looking at changing trends in use. But what I want to talk about is actually something I've been involved with in my spare time, which is drug checking in the UK and why I think it's important. So I'll say something about the international context in terms of drug markets and the increase in drug purity and the significance of that in relation to drug-related deaths in Europe. I'll say something about the specific context of festivals, festival prevalence of drug use, and also the wider festival industry and why it's a particularly interesting subject to study, and what the responses have been in terms of on-site harm reduction and particularly drug checking. So first of all, in terms of the international context, lots of you, this will be familiar to you, but brief overview of some of the key drug trends. I think that we're seeing a globalisation of illicit drug markets, which has been at least partly facilitated by the revolution in information and communication technologies, particularly the internet in terms of retail distribution, so the dark and clear web. We've seen the emergence and the rise of new psychoactive substances, so 750 in the last decade. And we're now seeing about 1 new psychoactive substance per week. So it was about 2 per week in the peak in 2014. So the rate of appearance of new MPS is declining, but nevertheless, it's still 1 new one every week. Meanwhile, we've seen a fracturing or fragmentation of the global drug prohibition regime. You've got legalisation of cannabis in lots of states. We don't in the UK have any legalisation of cannabis. However, across Europe, we're seeing growing number of countries that are decriminalising, if not legalising, and the claimed end to the war on drugs. We're also seeing a downturn in developed countries around the world in terms of youth alcohol consumption. We started to see the first signs of that about a decade ago, and it's really picking up speed now. And so the consequence of all of that is we're seeing a growing access to and appeal for alternative psychoactive experiences in people's leisure time for recreational purposes. And I'll come back to the definition of recreational towards the end. Alongside all of that, we've got a growing drug-related death rate. And for the UK, this is probably the biggest issue that we've got at the moment. Our drug-related death rate is the highest on record and the highest in Europe, along with Estonia. And this has been increasingly driving the reaction to drug policy in the UK and this desire to be doing something differently to address this. And there's a recognition that policing has played a part in this situation, as well as underfunding of public services and of public health in the past 10 years. So if we look at drug-related deaths, and this is just for cocaine and MDMA, but we can see this for other drugs as well, we have a fluctuation in drug-related death rates and a dip in around about 2008, 9, 10. And then it's been increasing since then to the highest rates on record. And these 2 graphs go up to 2016. This has been carrying on for the next 2 years since. But keep an eye on that dip, because this is a really interesting thing. If we look at MDMA in particular, what we can see is when MDMA first appeared in the UK, there were around about 15 to 20 people a year died from that. Then Vietnam banned saffron oil production. And what we saw was it shifted to Cambodia, to MDMA crystal being sold. I think you call it Mandy here, MD, Mandy. I call it Magic in Manchester, where I'm from. And we saw the drug-related death rate increase as people were taking whole rocks of pure MDMA crystal. And then when Cambodia banned saffron oil production, we had the shift with the precursor ingredients to China. We saw the use of PMK. And what the consequence of that was, after this dip in drug-related deaths in the UK, is year on year we've had an increase in drug-related deaths, along with the fact that pills have changed in the UK. So instead of the round white tablets that I started doing research on 25 years ago, there are all sorts of different shapes, sizes and colours, and all the different logos that appear. So they've changed visually. There are concerns about the fact that they don't have a score line on them, so it's very difficult to break some of them in half if they don't have a score line. But the key thing here is that it's the high and variable strength of these pills which is a direct driver for this increased drug-related death rate. So last year, 92 people died from MDMA-related deaths in the UK. This isn't from adulterants, this is from MDMA implicated in their deaths. And if you look at the average strength of a pill in the UK, back in 2010, there was under half an adult dose under 50 milligrams of MDMA in a pill. This has now gone up to over 170, 180 milligrams average. We test pills with my charity, which are regularly coming up at 200, 250, 300 milligrams of MDMA, so 3 times an adult dose. So what we've got in the UK is a perfect storm, really. We have amongst the highest prevalence of drug use in Europe. We have the highest purity on record. Availability, unsurprisingly perhaps, 9 in 10 ecstasy users say in the UK that they can access MDMA within 24 hours, fairly or very easily. However, the really interesting thing is that even by Home Office statistics, nearly 4 in 10 adults who've never tried MDMA in the UK reckon they could get a hold of it within 24 hours, fairly or very easily. So it's very cheap, it's very easily available. The price hasn't really gone up much. It's about £5 a pill, although bearing in mind the exchange rate, that probably is cents in America at the moment. Drug-related harm, meanwhile, is escalating. It's calculated to be costing the UK 11 billion a year. Drug-related deaths, I've said that it's such a significant driver, the highest in Europe, the highest on record. Add to the mix, we've got new psychoactive substances, we've got the fentanyl analogues missold as opiates, much less of a problem in the UK and Europe than in the States, but nevertheless, starting to see it. Cathinones being missold as MDMA and cannabinoids, synthetic cannabinoids as cannabis. Combined with all of that, and for me as a criminologist, one of the things that's been interesting is under the Conservative government, we've had a cut to all public services, including the police. There's been more than a 20% cut to policing budgets, which has meant there's less police on the streets. It's been seen to be linked to an increase in crime, a decrease in detection of crime. It's also led to an increase in disgruntlement with central government by the police, and a willingness to do things differently. So whilst we have a prohibitionist central government, we also have a relatively large amount of independence for local police, and they've been starting to experiment with drug diversion schemes. We also start to see fast-track graduates, criminology graduate recruitment into the police who are more interested in evidence-based policing and doing things a little bit differently. That really has been a fertile ground for us to wiggle through the middle and try and get drug checking off the ground. And one of the things that I've been involved with is the reframing of festival drug policy away from zero tolerance and towards something that we borrowed from counter-terrorism policing, which we call the 3 Ps. And that is to accept that the police will want to prevent drugs getting on site, because that's the reality of the current drug control system we live in, that they will pursue drug dealers on site. But the 3rd P is to protect the general public, and that within that frame of protecting the general public, we've argued that we should be having drug checking or drug safety testing on site. And the police have gone along with that, and this is a quote from a police officer that I've worked with, Jason Q. And when I asked him why have the police been supportive of us getting this off the ground in the UK, he said, I've just dealt with too much death. When people have died in the UK, when people have died at festivals, it's the police who knock on the door of parents and have to tell them the news. So even the police have had enough of this situation. So we managed to get drug checking off the ground at festivals to start with, and I have to say festivals is only the starting point, but I think they're really interesting and a useful place to explore this because they're a huge business in the UK, £2,500 million business. Who knows how many festivals there are? It totally depends how you define it, whether you include jazz festivals or literary festivals or community festivals. But by any estimate, there's over 700. Some estimates are over 900 a year. Somewhere between 7 million and 10 million people go to these every year. And we have small festivals under 25,000 people right up to Glastonbury, which is 250,000 people. And I guess lots of you have been there. 250,000 people on a dairy farm for a week, creating a whole new alternative town. Quite an experience. So they are intense social spaces for a short temporary period of time where they aim to have this carnival-esque suspension of social rules, social controls, sometimes with the idea of an inversion of social rules. People might have a moral holiday, to use the term of Matt's a criminologist. They'll do things differently. They might do things they would do in their day-to-day life. They'll be willing to experiment, and that will include pharmacological experimentation. And they've been described by the sociologist Hakim Bey as temporary autonomous zones for people to be doing things differently. It's time out from everyday life. I conduct annual surveys at festivals in the UK, so this is the only annual survey that's conducted in the UK of drug use at festivals. And what we can see is over half of people take drugs at festivals in the UK, The most popular drugs are MDMA in crystal and pill form, cocaine, ketamine, nitrous oxide, usually in various combinations of these. What people tend to like at the moment, I'd say, is the shorter lasting drugs. So ketamine is very, very popular. It's half an hour of fun, of silliness. Less interest in the commitment to 8, 10, 12, 24-hour trips in those sorts of circumstances. And I think the prevalence is increasing for things like LSD, but the prevalence is increasing faster from a low base rate for things like 2CB. I've described festival drug use as atypical intoxication for various reasons. As we know with various other studies around Europe, more people take more drugs at festivals than they do in their everyday lives. Partly that's because it's 4 days or more where they're away from the constraints of home, of work, of family. We found more than half of people take illegal drugs at some point over the festival, but also more than half of those take larger quantities than they normally would. And also a quarter take a larger number of drugs than they normally would. So it's not just that there's more people taking drugs, the people taking the drugs are taking more of them as well. And half of people who are taking drugs are taking at least 2. So polydrug use is significant, and polysubstance use, i.e. mixing with alcohol, is significant as well. Almost everybody who's taking drugs is drinking alcohol on top of that, at least in the UK. But the other thing I think is interesting that we found from our research is that 1 in 12 people only take drugs at festivals now. And quite often these are people in their 30s and 40s who may have kids, and then once a year they give the kids to the grandparents and they go have a blowout at the festival. Often they think they know a lot about drugs, but they don't necessarily know a lot about the current drug market. They'll say things like, pills aren't like they used to be back in the day, and they're not like they used to be back in the day. They're 3 times stronger. So that actually can be added risk for those people who are there just once a year. So people are taking more drugs, longer drug-taking sessions, and more drugs altogether. So there's a window of opportunity for festival drug users to be taking drugs, but we also see this as a window of opportunity to be engaging with people, to discuss drugs with them, and also to be able to test the drugs for them to find out what's in them. So drug checking is it's nothing new. It's been around for more than 50 years. It's a particular harm reduction response where you're directly engaging with individual drug users. So it's not by post, it's not via third parties. You're having some sort of lab-level forensic testing, so not just reagent testing. You will have an individual consultation. You don't usually just give out the test results. You have some sort of direct healthcare engagement with the individual, and the primary aim is harm reduction. It can be linked to any policy regime. It doesn't have to just be linked to one particular one. It's a pragmatic response to the current situation we're in, where drugs are illegal. We don't know what's in them. The police probably don't know what's in them, and sometimes street-level dealers don't know what's in them. So we introduced it in 2016 in the UK. The idea of it is, I think there's 4 key aims really in terms of drug checking. Firstly, we can get information to people who are using drugs on-site and off-site, and also to the emergency services about what's in circulation and monitor those trends. Secondly, we can identify contaminants and adulterants, missold drugs, these variations in purity, which is such a concern in the UK at the moment. We can also have this individual direct engagement with healthcare staff. So harder to reach and potentially hidden groups of drug users will be able to engage with medical or healthcare services who might not have done so before. But really the unique contribution of drug checking is you talk to an individual, you find out what they think they've bought, you test it, you tell them what they've actually bought, and you make that connection and can assess the mis-selling in the market. Which we don't know unless we talk to individuals. And then we can target any particular alerts at the correct drug-using group. So if a substance is being missold, we don't necessarily put out the warning just about the substance. We also know then who the target audience is, who would have bought it and thought they'd got something else. So as I said, it's nothing new. It actually goes back 50 years to California, and they had acid rescue in California. And then it really took off from the late 1980s with the party scene, dance, drug and rave scenes in Europe. We've now got about 29, 30 drug checking organisations around the world. And there was a third wave of expansion of drug checking in North America, in Australasia, and also with us in the UK. So although it goes back to 1987 in Amsterdam, of course, all the good stuff starts there, we introduced it in 2016 in the UK with my charity, The Loop. And it was really a gradual evolution that we were on site. We started supporting the police testing of confiscations. We started testing in medical emergencies. and we won over the support of all of the emergency and online services on site. And then we were able to argue and say, why don't we let the public come and bring samples, substances of concern as well? So it was a sort of gradual evolution of the process. To very briefly talk you through it, what happens is people submit a sample at the front of the tent, and it will then go along a production line of testing, basically. They get a raffle ticket, it's very low tech, go away for an hour, come back, and in the course of that hour, we'll have a whole range of analytical processes. First of all, we'll measure, we'll weigh, we'll photograph, and I'll come back to the photographs, that's really important, the sample. We'll use infrared spectroscopy to get a quick initial idea of what the sample is. We'll then remove the binders, the colour, to be able to get more accurate idea of what the substance is. We might use reagents. If it's a particularly potent substance like LSD, it's useful for that. And then we will quantify, which is so important in terms of this issue of purity. We'll use UV spectroscopy, and we'll use mass loss analysis for that. We carry fentanyl strips to do opiate testing, but we very rarely have opiates submitted for testing in the UK, and we've never ever had a positive fentanyl strip. We're also trialling bespoke mass spectroscopy, as are quite a few other organisations. I think the key thing here is the technology is getting better, it's getting quicker, it's getting more accurate, it's getting cheaper. The problem is at the moment the equipment still doesn't like going to festivals. They don't like the heat, the mud, the rain. So we've got some work to do with the technology in relation to that. I say we, that's my colleagues, the chemists. So we started off at 2 festivals, then 3 festivals for the testing for the public, and then last year we were at 12 festivals and 7 of them were public-face testing. And we can test up to 400 samples a day now. The Loop's actually the fastest testing organisation in the world. I'll take the applause, but that's absolutely for the chemists because they're awesome. And that's a picture of them in their little sweatshop laboratory. So about half the samples submitted are MDMA, 1 in 5 are ketamine, about 1 in 5 are cocaine, and then there's everything else, the psychedelics and bulking agents and contaminants. The MDMA samples are about half pills, half crystal. And we find, not surprisingly, very variable strength. Our average last year was 168 milligrams, but as I say, our strongest pills have been 350 milligrams. What's really interesting for me as a criminologist is that we now know the extent of misselling in the marketplace. We had no idea about this before. And this is consistently coming up again and again, about 1 in 5 samples that people buy are not what they thought they bought. In terms of MDMA last summer, about 1 in 20 samples were not MDMA, they were N-ethylpentalone. And this was our biggest problem last summer. And this was also the biggest problem for the New Zealand Drug Checking Organisation last summer. So this is a significant issue around the world because N-ethylpentalone is a very, very strong cathinone, lasts a long time. It looks and smells almost identical to MDMA, so you wouldn't know unless you either tasted it or tested it that it wasn't that. The real problem is it causes anxiety, paranoia, insomnia, and if people redose because initially they think they've got a low dose of MDMA, which is possible with the initial effects, then it can last potentially 2 to 4 days of no sleep. We have psychiatrists in our team, and they diagnosed full-blown psychotic episodes. It's so serious and it's such a horrible drug for people to be missold. So it's absolutely vital. The other interesting thing about N-ethylpentalone was that when we started testing, methylone was being missold as MDMA. And as I'm sure lots of you know, it's not a million miles away in terms of effect. It was obviously going to be cheaper for the dealers to be selling that along the supply chains. But when that was banned in China, they then moved to mis-selling N-ethylpentalone, which is far more harmful. And so we can see this problem really, which is that each time a substance is banned, then another one takes its place, as we know. So this summer, N-ethylpentalone has been banned. What we've seen is a fall in N-ethylpentalone being missold as MDMA, but we've yet to see what will take its place. And of course, our concern is that, as with synthetic cannabinoids, you ban each generation, and the generation that follows actually is more harmful, which is the perversity of prohibition and the problem that we've got, which is why we need to be testing. But the testing isn't just about the forensics, the testing is also about these healthcare consultations. So we ask people about their drugs history, their medical history, current drug use, use of medications, which is a really important thing. We have a lot of people come to us and say, I'm on XYZ medication, how does it interact with illegal drugs? I don't want to talk to my family doctor about this. We have people who might have multiple sclerosis say, how does this interact with my illegal drug use? For legal reasons, we say the safest way to take drugs is not to take them at all. 9 in 10 of the people who we see have never spoken to a healthcare professional about their drug use before. So we're really picking up this hidden population. And then after talking to us, after hearing about the strength of the substance, after discussing dosage, 2 in 5 say that they are going to take smaller amounts of that substance in future. And another 1 in 5, when they hear what the substance is, they say, you know what, we don't even want to take this, and they hand over those substances that we give to the police to destroy. So everyone's happy. You know, drug users are happy they're not taking that substance. The police are happy because we're taking contaminants out of the supply chain. And then the medics are happy because they're not having to deal with the fallout of if people have taken these substances. And 1 in 20 people ask for onward referral to a drug service because we're in a festival, it's loud, it's noisy, it's crazy. It's just a 15-20 minute intervention. People say they do want to carry on with those discussions, and so we can refer them on to those services. But there are really interesting differences between service users. We find that more women engage with the service, more younger drug users, and also more new initiates taking the drugs for the first time. So it seems to be that older and male and more experienced drug users don't feel the need for drug checking services. It might be that they're more confident in the supply line chains. They might think they already know everything they need to know about harm reduction. But we've got some interesting gender and age differences starting to come out in this. The other interesting thing for me, though, as a criminologist, is we're finding out so much more about the illegal drug market. One of the things we found out is that people who sell drugs on site in the UK are twice as likely to rip off people who are buying drugs than their neighbourhood dealers. Obviously, in these huge crowds, it's easy to sell something and get lost in the crowd. They might not even be drug dealers in day-to-day life. They've just gone to the kitchen, got something, a white powder, and then trying to make a bit of money off it. The police call them cash neutral. They've just come to earn their own money at the spending money at the festival. Now we have this information, I can go back to the festivals and say to them, if you have a massive army of police and security staff at the gates, if you've got sniffer dogs, the people who are more scared about walking past them, the younger and less experienced drug users, they're the ones then who buy on site, and they're the ones who are more vulnerable to being ripped off by their on-site dealers. So we can have these conversations and say, do you really want to be having this army at the gates, and to think what the unintended consequences of that can be in terms of actually increasing drug-related harm? So we give information to the service users. We also give information to emergency services on site. We feed into early warning systems at regional, national, and also international level. We put out alerts on our social media. That gets picked up. You can see on the right-hand side that it was even our Donald Trump warning was picked up by the Washington Post. So we have problems with Donald Trump even in the UK as well. He's caused some deaths in the UK. We're also part of the European Drug Checking Group and a subgroup that we're pooling our data so we know more about what's being bought and sold around Europe. We also work very closely with drug checking organisations around the world. We're all little NGOs, we have hardly any money, but we have a lot of goodwill and we share our results, our ideas, even our equipment at times. And we're also now starting to write academic publications coming out of this. We put out our alerts in the UK, and this was an alert this summer for the 10 highest strength pills. And these, you might wonder why we put out a warning about high strength pills. The reason is, going back to my original point, is that the increased drug-related deaths in the UK relates to this increasingly strong variable pills. We had a terrible summer in terms of festival deaths. Just on August bank holiday, 5 people died because of taking high-strength pills. And these are some of the ones implicated. So it's so important that we get that message out. And we know that more than 500,000 people have seen these messages. And they also get picked up by music press like Mixmag, and also by the local press as well. So we're just trying to get that message out there. So it's about this ripple effect off-site as well as on-site. These are some more of our alerts for high-strength pills. And I wanted to show you this because this is about the misselling. We've had PMMA that's missold as MDMA this summer. We've got the ketamine analogue 2-FDCK, which is stronger and longer lasting, is being missold as ketamine, M-bombs as LSD, and N-ethylpenicillin that I've already mentioned. So we can flag this up, and we'll say very specifically, at this festival, or even this area of this festival, people are selling this substance. The Yellow Superman pills, once we put out that alert, people came to our service and handed in the pills, and we tested them and they were PMMA, so we know we took that out of the market. So we know that we can access hidden populations. As I say, over 9 in 10 have never spoken to a healthcare professional before. 1 in 10 we can signpost on to drug services. We know that we can take substances of concern out of circulation. People say they're going to take less after they've talked to us about issues of dosage and purity. 1 in 5 hand over substances that they don't want to take, that we can destroy. And we also provide information and intelligence to emergency services, which means that we can have a reduction in hospital admissions because of the reduction in people taking these substances. And finally, in terms of this unique connection between what people have bought and what they think they've bought, I think N-methylpentylone last summer was the best example of that. If you tell people they've bought N-methylpentylone, they won't take it. They wanted to buy MDMA, but we can put out the alert to MDMA users to say this is being missold as this. It's not there's a sudden new wave of interest in ethylpentylone, it's that it's being missold as MDMA. So we know that people will present early if they've already unfortunately taken the substances. That means that there's less likelihood of them being hospitalised. But also the other thing is emergency services have said to us that they're much more confident about treating people on site. So in our very first pilot, there was a 95% reduction in hospital admissions from that festival at Boomtown. Oh. I thought somebody famous was standing behind me. There's a 25% reduction in medical incidents on site at Boomtown, according to an independent report, and the Red Cross said that at a Bristol festival, Love Say Today, was a 12% reduction because of our testing service. So we are collecting data to show that it works. We put out these alerts to emergency services. I think a couple of challenges are, first of all, trying to disaggregate the data, because unfortunately a lot of festivals, they collect data on alcohol and drug-related problems. So separating out the legal and the illegal drugs is really tricky to be able to show that we can make an impact if it gets merged in with all of the alcohol and we're making less impact on that. In fact, there are also concerns whether you might be perversely driving people to drink more alcohol if you're warning about illegal drugs on site, but that's a discussion for a different day. And we also have to be careful with our alerts. I think people could get alert fatigue, and what we've seen is people have, it's become really sexy to put out alerts on Twitter, and we've seen some people put out alerts with rather sketchy forensic evidence basing it. So a couple of final points. First of all, festivals are psychedelic spaces. They're leisure spaces, they're play spaces, they're psychedelic spaces, but we need appropriate wraparound support. We need confidential, non-judgmental, non-directive support, preparation, information, and testing as well off-site. But all of this costs money. Our charity has virtually no income, virtually no expenditure. We have an amazing group of professional volunteers, but really we need to be putting more money into this around the world. And we also need to understand differentiated consumption. We don't need to have 24-hour trip sitting at a heavy rock concert where everyone's drinking alcohol. So we need to have an understanding of differentiated drug use and of the support services that are appropriate. Testing on site as well as off site to let other wider drug using communities know about that. But also if things do go wrong, and things will go wrong, we do need support on site in terms of the medics, the welfare, and also trip sitting if that's appropriate, if people are taking drugs on site. But finally I wanted to say it's not really about drug checking at all. It's about informing and empowering people who are using drugs. It's about recognising them as agents of change. It's about valuing cognitive liberty and pharmacological pleasure. And it's about building bridges between those stakeholders who often don't talk to each other otherwise, getting them around the table together to work on these issues, to promote health and to promote human rights above criminal justice. And the emerging research, I've just given a flavour of some of that in terms of understanding drug markets, illegal drug markets. And it can operate in any policy context as well. This isn't just about prohibition. We need quality control in any prohibitionist, in any drug control regime. But in the meantime, it creates little zones of decriminalisation in whatever drug control regime there might be. And it might be a stepping stone to further drug policy reform. In the meantime, though, the key thing is we've got the highest drug-related rates on record, we've got an international opiate crisis, we've got this issue of new psychoactive substances increasingly being missold as traditional street drugs, and we've also now increasingly got organised crime within crypto markets. The dark web is becoming a very different place as well. So I would argue that it's the most important harm reduction intervention of the 21st century, and that it should be funded by national public health. Thank you.
I'm wondering how you go about getting these substances that are being missold out of circulation, aside from just putting out alerts.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I guess part of the idea with the alerts is that if you inform the general population and they don't want to be taking these substances, then they won't. And one of the things that's happened in Europe is very quickly they've been able to just remove any demand for a substance, and so they effectively have to get rid of them. An example of that would be the PMMA Superman pills, that they put out alerts very quickly in the Netherlands and around Europe, and so people just didn't want to be buying those. So I think there's a potential feedback loop that if you can get enough information out to enough people, then the product is effectively worthless. We don't have a lot of evidence about that at the moment. I mean, that's still an emerging area. I'm really interested in that, what impact people can have. And there's also a debate about why the Dutch and Belgian manufacturers are making such strong pills as well, which are 3 and 4 times an adult dose. And, you know, a pill that's 3 times an adult dose is only more dangerous because people don't know it's 3 times an adult dose. And if you break it into 3, it's an adult dose. So it's, in a way, it's such a simple message. But I think, again, the perversity of prohibition is that a lot of sentences for if suppliers are caught with drugs, the sentences used to be relevant to how many pills they had on them. So if you have pills that are 3 or 4 times as strong, then you're going to get a jail sentence which is only a third or a quarter because of the volume. However, in the UK, they've now, like the criminal justice system, of course, has caught up with that. So now what happens is they will say how many doses, not how many pills. So, but I think for a little while, before the criminal justice system caught up, there was a perverse driver that if you made stronger pills, you would get a shorter jail sentence if you were caught, as well as, of course, the volume is a quarter of the size in terms of trying to traffic it across international borders. But yes, so going back to your point, I think, you know, unless and until we have drug policy reform, it remains an illegal market and it's controlled by organised crime, then I think the drivers have to become from customers voting with their feet and having that information to vote with their feet.
I was just wondering if you had any ideas on the cause or the reasoning between the difference that UK has in, you said that they don't really have a lot of fentanyl in their drugs, but like in the United States, obviously that's a big issue. So I don't know if you had any idea or insight of what caused that difference.
I think the perspective from Europe about the North American fentanyl crisis relates to, particularly in the States, to private prescription and the way that the healthcare system works. It's actually much more difficult to get meds in the UK. So I think one of the things is there's a much tighter rein on it, and there's much less seepage from the medical supplies to the illegal market. In the same way that we have here. So there have been some fentanyl deaths, but they've tended to be that they're not in the illegal drug supply. What's happened is people have taken other people's meds, or there's been a mistake, or families have got access to them, or things like that. So those have been the sorts of circumstances, as opposed to contamination of the illegal supply chain. Almost all of our fentanyl deaths have been related to somewhere along the line the legitimate prescription. So it's been a little bit of a different situation. But I think in the UK we have such a tight stronghold on prescribing that there hasn't been that level of seepage.
I just wanted to know if you're familiar with efforts like this in the United States. There's like Zendo project at Burning Man,
yeah.
But I don't know of any like testing. And what's standing in the way of that happening?
Well, there were various people to talk to in relation to that. I think at DanceSafe, they've now got a FT infrared spectroscopy machine, and they've started testing in Florida. And I know there's been a lot of work in New York, and the Drug Policy Alliance, and Stephanie Jones, who was here yesterday at Drug Policy Alliance, she's been doing a lot of work on that, trying to be introducing that. So I think it's either at tipping point on the cusp, or actually in a few places it's definitely started to happen. Interestingly, a criminologist called Dina Perrone, New Yorker, who's now in LA, she's been involved with the testing. So it's something about criminologists and testing going on here. And she did a PhD on club drug use, New York club kids. And now she's involved with testing and DanceSafe. And I think their first testing was very recently in Florida. And maybe the Chicago Recovery Alliance have been doing some in relation to opiates as well. I think because of the fentanyl issue here, I think there's been some funding to be buying technology to be doing this testing.
As representatives of the psychedelic community, what is the best way we can act as individuals in these environments such as festivals and nightclubs to promote harm reduction and safety in population that may not be as interested in perhaps being lectured by other people about drug use?
Wow, oh my gosh, that's a huge question. I think probably all of you can answer that better than me. Well, advocacy, activism, volunteering, all of those things. But also, if people are in those spaces, our number one harm reduction message is, always to be looking after each other. In the UK, some of the festival deaths have often been where people have been separated from their friends and they've just slumped in a corner thing. So even in the most practical way, keeping an eye on strangers slumped in corners, that's, I can think specifically of certain individuals where that's been the case. At sounding like, I've got a 22-year-old daughter who goes to festivals, but I'll sound like a mother now saying, they don't take their coat with them, and they lose their bags and they lose their phone and blah blah. But it's true. They get separated from the friends. They put the phone in the friend's bag, and then strangers don't know whether they're necessarily having a good time or not, whether they're asleep or not. So I think kindness towards strangers in social and psychedelic spaces definitely.
Thank you.
So, how effective are those simple reagent test kits for spotting the common forms of fake MDMA that one might find?
So we use reagent testing within our laboratory, and it's really helpful for specific high-potency substances. So to give you an example, LSD, if you tested it with infrared spectroscopy, it would just pick up the paper from the blotter, because the primary ingredient is the paper blotter. Whereas if you use reagents, then it will pick up the LSD. However, the concern is because it's just a one-color change, you're only going to get a hit for the predominant ingredient within a compound. So if you had something which was, just slightly over 50% of one substance and just slightly under 50% of another, there'll be concern that you wouldn't necessarily know what that combination was. So I think it can tell you what something isn't. So for example, if you bought MDMA and you didn't have the correct color change for that, you would know it wasn't MDMA, but you wouldn't necessarily know what it was. So I think it's about, I've seen our chemists use them, and I think they have real value if people know how to use them. But I think along with people buying the reagents, they really need to read the instructions. In the UK, we started giving them out to students, and my concern is that they don't necessarily know exactly how to use them, and they might be mistaken by the results. So I guess I would like to advocate for what they have in the Netherlands. In the Netherlands, the government puts €1 million a year into their drug checking network. There's at least 30 different drug checking centres around the Netherlands, and people can drop in and get samples tested. So I guess if you had that level of national coverage, then people would be less likely to have to rely on reagent testing.
I'm just wondering if there's research that's showing the relationship between the increase in deaths with the commercialization of the raves as opposed to the rave culture that sparked that.
That's that's a really interesting question. I mean, there isn't any research per se, and I guess I think really because each drug-related death is so specific and complex and multifactorial, I think it will be really difficult to look at the impact of commercialization on that. I think in the UK with festivals, what they do, I guess, is sell the image of transgression and to young people, at least for this short period of time. And there is genuine transgression in the fact that more than half of people are taking drugs, and they're taking more drugs than they would in everyday life. But they're also being sold that as well, in the names like Secret Garden Party and Lost Village, and these are expensive places to go. And for me, drug checking, we got it off the ground in festivals, but we're now doing testing in some city centres, is because in a way it's quite a privileged demographic. They're very expensive to go to, hundreds of pounds. You have to be able to buy all of your camping equipment, get there, in the middle of nowhere, you need transport and so on. So there's no doubt that they are predominantly businesses. However, there's so many different festivals. There are also the ones which are more exploratory, transformational, non-monetary, a bit more of the Burning Man ethos. And what I don't think we'll be able to do is what we could do, but what we've not done, is compare the drug-related death between the two. And I guess that would be the way to tease out your question. I think the problem would be the scale of the commercial ones as opposed to the alternative ones. It's a really interesting question, I think, in terms that might relate as well to people's own understanding and knowledge and experience of the drugs that they're taking. I think in a lot of the big commercial festivals, in a way, it's this perfect storm of concern around young people who might be relatively drug inexperienced, who are taking these very cheap, very strong substances. And one of the things that we're trying to warn about at the moment and guard against is a lot of these deaths are when they take 2 at once. And you can imagine that if it's 300 milligrams of MDMA, they're taking 600 at once. There might be 16, 17, 18. It definitely, we can see links with body mass index, interesting gender differences, age. So there's so many different factors to look at that I'd be cautious about just picking commercialization as one, but it's definitely something to think about.
Thank you.